Welcome to Within the Frame, where we delve into the most up-to-date issues across the globe. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Today marks World Food Day, a day designated to promote awareness and action in support of the millions of people worldwide who suffer from hunger and malnutrition. Though notable populations in many countries are suffering from chronic diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, and high cholesterol, partly due to hypernutrition, many people from the other side of the world are still suffering from hunger and starvation. About 10% of the global population is experiencing famine, which means about 800 million are starving. And with worsening climate change and ongoing conflicts across the globe, the situation seems to be getting worse. In light of the occasion, we will take a closer look at the current food crisis and speak to an expert about possible solutions to tackle the situation. For this, we are joined by the President of the International Fund for Agricultural Development of the UN, Alvaro Alario, with us. Welcome to the program, Mr. Alario.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming in. So first, for our viewers, could you give us an explanation of what the International Fund for Agricultural Development is and also on its role?
Yes, well, as you mentioned, we invest in the first mile. That means where food is being produced. And usually this is mostly in rural areas. At the same time, in rural areas is also where poverty is concentrated. So for us, it's an investment in these hundreds of millions of small-scale farmers in providing them access to land, access to water, access to finance, access to credit, and many times linking them to the global value chains, because in many cases they are not able to really connect to these global value chains. For us, we really invest in the rural communities, in the small-scale farmers across the entire world.
Right. So before we get into the details of the food crisis, we hear it's your first visit to South Korea.
That's correct, yes.
What are the reasons behind your visit?
Well, Korea is a founding member of IFAD, and they have been very much supporting IFAD in a variety of manners. And for me, it's very important to try to get more connection with the current government and see how we can co-invest in many parts of the world, whether it's in Asia, in Africa, and we very much count on their support and their leadership in many cases in terms of development, and their interest also, given what Korea has been going through the last decades. I think it's a great example of how we can really increase production, productivity, and tackle poverty and hunger.
Right. So it could be a very meaningful visit for you and also for South Korea as well. Mr. Alario, there are growing concerns about the global food crisis becoming a long-term problem. Before we delve into the causes, can you tell us how severe is the situation regarding food insecurity around the world?
Well, as you mentioned, over the last decades, we have had a declining trend in terms of hunger and poverty. We have gone from almost 1 in 3 of the population being hunger and poor to now 1 in 10, so that's good news. Unfortunately, after COVID, we have seen over 100 million going backwards and going once more into malnutrition, poverty, hunger. So the current data, unfortunately, are not very positive. I think that's why we need to readdress and rethink how we can invest more into these rural areas where poverty is concentrated.
Right. We will touch upon global issues like the pandemic again as we speak. There have been several crises in the past few years. Climate change, pandemic, Ukraine war. These have affected food security across the world. How can we address these kinds of problems? It's kind of inevitable for us.
That's a very good point. I think what we need to address actually is the root causes of poverty and food insecurity. Many times we invest a lot into the humanitarian space after the crisis has happened, after the conflict has happened, after the extreme weather event has happened, but we need to invest in resilience. That means in making sure that these populations are ready for when the shock happens. And that means also tackling a lot of the root causes. What we saw after the COVID crisis is that many of the heads of state, especially in Africa, realized that they needed to become self-sufficient, that what was happening like 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers away, it was affecting how they could really tackle a lot of the hunger issues in their own populations. And I think a very good example is South Korea, for sure, in terms of the self-reliance on rice. And I think there's a lot of countries that can also increase their local production, diversify in terms of crops, integrate into the regional markets. And all of this needs to happen putting the small-scale farmers at the center, because this is where hundreds of millions of jobs are being created, and we need to go from, I would say, we need to invest in where the food is being produced, which is that first mile.
Right, so in order to solve this problem, we have to go into the root cause, which is production. Right.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Now, South Korea is a founding member of IFAD, and we want to ask, how is South Korea currently supporting IFAD's initiatives, and can you elaborate on the partnership between IFAD and South Korea?
So South Korea is one of the donors of IFAD, but that's just one small part. I think the most important part is how can we co-invest, how can we have some of the lessons learned from Korea in its development vis-a-vis technology, vis-a-vis rice seeds, for example. How can we also transfer that type of knowledge into other countries? A very good initiative, for example, is the Kai Race project in terms of trying to use a lot of the seeds and the technology that South Korea has developed into African countries. At the same time, we believe that there's also a community-driven approach that happened during the development of Korea, the New Village Initiative. I think that community-based and that rural development can also serve as a lesson learned for the rest of the world.
Right, so you've mentioned the K Rice Belt project. Then how do you assess efforts towards achieving food security and sustainable agriculture efforts of South Korea?
Well, I think this is a great program by which South Korea is trying to get some of the high-yielding rice seeds, some of the advances in agriculture productivity to a number of African countries. And they are being quite ambitious. I think IFAD can certainly support these efforts and also diversify them away of not only rice, but there's other crops that we can also support many of the African countries and low-income countries into becoming self-sufficient, which is an important part of the objective.
Right. So we've mentioned some projects that go along with South Korea. Then can we ask how important is cooperation with Korea and for IFAD? And furthermore, taking a step more, what more areas could we cooperate further?
So I think one of them, and today I was, for example, with the Korean Development Agency president or Korean Export-Import Bank, you have a number of institutions which are making great investments across the world. What for us it's important is that those investments are not only in infrastructure or energy, which are very important also, because if you produce food, you need also roads, you need energy you need cold storage, so there's a lot of other aspects and sectors that need to be invested. But the most important part is that these investments go to the small-scale producers, to the small-scale fishermen, and I think that's where a combination, I would say, of having bigger companies, for example, from South Korea, integrating small-scale farmers and fishermen from this type of countries, low-income countries, would be important. That connection, I think, we can also support in these investments.
Right. And also at the COP28 last year in Dubai, a commitment was made to mobilize $2.5 billion to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and protect the lives of farmers threatened by climate change. Do you consider this enough? And also, what efforts would be necessary to ensure that these funds are used where they're most needed?
So agriculture, as everybody knows, is one of the producers of greenhouse emissions. At the same time, it can be also part of the solution. The way that, for example, you produce rice can be done with more or less impact towards climate. And I think what is important is to recognize that we can produce food in a more sustainable manner and also in a way that also preserves and supports nature. To do that, it's very important that we also invest in adaptation. Unfortunately, for every dollar that is invested into adaptation, there's $12 into mitigation. And at the same time, small-scale farmers across the world are the ones who are suffering about the floods, the droughts, the extreme heat. So we need to also invest right now in supporting many of these farmers. Let me give you just one figure. Currently, out of the entire hundreds of billions and trillions that go into climate finance, less than 1% goes to small-scale farmers. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of people that need solutions right now.
Then can I also ask, what do the majority of the funds, where do the majority of the funds go?
Well, most of it is actually into mitigation, which is very important to address the long-term also structural needs. It's into the energy transition, but very few to actually solve the problems that hundreds of millions of people have right now, because they need solutions to adapt right now. for example, we need drought-resistant seeds. We need also weather alarm systems that can also prevent and get some of the populations ready for when things happen. We need submergible roads. We need ways to adapt right now. We cannot wait for the next years. The hundreds of millions of people who are suffering now cannot wait.
Then what kind of efforts has IFAD made to address food crisis and alleviate poverty in developing countries?
So we invest in the first mile, but not only on production and productivity, but also on connecting farmers many times to the markets, on making sure that they are resilient towards investments in climate adaptation when these shocks happen. Let me give you figures. Over the last 3 years, for example, we increased the income of 77 million small-scale farmers. We increased the access to markets because it's important not only to produce, but to sell it, to have an income generation activity of 64 million. We increased the production of 62 million rural women and men over the world. So the impact that we have measured and the impact that we are producing is there, but we need to scale it up and we need to do it very fast because of the figures you started the interview with. 800 million are currently suffering. And there's a moral obligation, but also an investment case to invest in these hundreds of millions of small-scale farmers.
Right, so we keep emphasizing that the support towards small-scale farmers are very important. Alongside that, do you have any other points to emphasize, like which support is very important?
Well, when we are talking about, before we talked about hunger and poverty, I would say that investments in agriculture growth can create up to three times more of jobs and also decrease poverty than in other sectors. So actually these investments in agriculture create long-term resilience and also help feed a lot of the population. So it's also very important that these farmers get a fair share. So for every dollar when we go to the shop and we buy, they get like 6.5 cents out of this. So it's important that across the value chain they also get a fair price and a fair share of the overall, because if we invest in these communities, that will prevent a lot of the forced migration, a lot of the suffering. Otherwise, we will continue pouring hundreds of billions into humanitarian assistance. So the only way to avoid that is to invest right now into the root causes.
Right. Can you also give us some more of your accomplishments of IFAD that helped alleviate food crisis?
Yeah, so I would say a very important part is the tens of millions of, I would say, increases in income. That changes many times also the dynamics in the community. It changes the relationship between the women and the men. It changes the opportunities and the hope of the youth, because many times this is their only way of generating income and being able to stay where they are. So I think by investing in this type of programs and these investments, you can really avoid future costs and also make sure that they have an opportunity and hope in terms of their own future, and in order to drive their own livelihoods and to create these opportunities that otherwise they would not have.
So this is the global food crisis is going internationally. It's a very important issue across the world, especially now that conflicts has been rising. Would you like to leave us a message to convey to governments and stakeholders about the urgency of addressing this food crisis?
Well, we are seeing that a lot of heads of state actually are currently talking about food security as a matter of national security, which I think it's important, because it's important that many countries have the ability of producing their own food, but also of diversifying across the food. Otherwise, they will, anytime there's a shock, a climate shock, anytime there's any type of conflict, they will be affected, their population will be affected. So I think it's important that we integrate a lot of this regional food production at the same time that every country also thinks carefully about what they would like to be self-sufficient in and invest, because it's very important to invest. Without the investment, everything will be just talk. So it's very important that we invest in the right technologies, in the right access to markets, and sometimes in many low-income countries, this means also investing in roads, investing in ports. Otherwise, it's not possible to export food or to even integrate. So there's a combination of investments that comes together. We call them investments in food systems, and they go beyond agriculture. It's an ecosystem across many of the sectors. Let me perhaps finalize also with 2 points. I mean, at the end of the day, agriculture and farming is a business. And there's 2 components that are very important. One is access to water, very clearly. And the other one is access to have a healthy soil. Without a healthy soil, you cannot produce. And we're seeing that soils are getting worse, and access to water, unfortunately, is becoming more intermittent. So we need investments in how to capture, manage water, but also in making sure that we're working with nature and that we have healthy soils in order to continue having food and products that are also nutritious, which is also a very important component.
Right. Mr. Lau, you gave us your final words, but can I just ask one more question?
Of course.
You mentioned like these kinds of supports are necessary and investments are necessary in a bigger level, but what about for us, like individuals? Could we be of some help to tackling global food crisis? What are some ways that we could practice in our daily lives that could at least give a helping hand to that?
That's a great question. I think we have the power as consumers to really select the type of, I would say, fruits, vegetables, meat that we actually eat. It's important to understand that, for example, for every kilo of meat, you are consuming 15,000 of water to produce 1 kilo of meat. It's important to understand that if we are buying fruits and vegetables that are not of the season, this has also an impact. It's important to understand that when we buy local produced food, there's also a consequence in terms of local jobs. So I think there's a lot of choices that as consumers we have. And it's not only for the industry or the big companies. I think we also need to be conscious of the power of our own choices.
Right, so selecting the food that we eat is also very important, and we can also give a helping hand to tackle global food crisis with our very small choices in our daily lives.
Or food waste, for example. It's clear that if we produce or we buy too much food and we waste it, that has a repercussion into the soil, the water, the nature resources that are not unlimited. So it's important that we also are conscious about food waste, food loss.
Right, so eat as much as you can and try not to leave as much as food waste.
Yep.
All right, we will have to conclude our discussion at this point. Mr. Lau, thank you so much for your time and your insights to this very important topic. We look forward to your contributions and your efforts to stabilize food security around the world.
Thank you very much, and happy World Food Day.
Thank you. Now that wraps up our program for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow at 8:30 p.m. Korea time. Until then, goodbye.